What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Thank you for joining me in episode 15, season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. I ask all of my guests 2 questions. 1, what for them is the essence of a real democracy? And 2, if they could change one thing about our system of democracy, what would it be? This is the 3rd episode where I've put together a range of my guests' answer to the question, if you could change one thing about our system of democracy, what would it be? We are very near the end of season 2, only 3 episodes to go, and I will soon be starting interviews for season 3 about elections, voting and alternatives. I intend to continue to ask all my guests for their view on what is the essence of a real democracy. I'm thinking of replacing the one change question from season 3 onwards and would appreciate your ideas on a new question. Please send your suggestions either by email to Nivek, Nivek, at realdemocracynow.com.au or let me know via Twitter or Facebook. I'll be starting the interviews for season 3 soon and would like to have the new question ready for those. In today's episode, we hear firstly from Professor Gerry Stoker, who was part of episode 12 in season 2, talking about the democratic deficit. Gerry is Professor of Governance and Social Sciences, Politics and International Relations at the University of Southampton. He is also the Centenary Professor of Governance in the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. In this episode, Gerry outlines both what his research says about what citizens would like changed, as well as sharing his own views.
Well, interesting enough, on a couple of occasions, we've actually asked citizens themselves that. We were more generous than you in that we gave them 3 things that they could change rather than just one. And I think in the study that we did in Britain and in the study we did in Australia, let me summarise what it is that people basically said. And broadly, what I think people said was it would be quite nice if representative democracy worked like it said it should in the books. That the kinds of reforms that they want are a reform to the way in which the representative system works. So they're worried about the way that political parties are financed. They're worried about the way that lobbying activity behaves. They're worried about the perhaps over emphasis on discipline within parties, which stops people from actually trying to represent the diversity of views that are actually out there. They therefore favour reforms, I think, that would try and make representative politics more clean and also more interactive. So they want better communication and better engagement from their elected representatives so that they feel as if they're in a dialogue with them, not simply just choosing them once every 3 or 4 years and then imagining that they can effectively get on and make decisions. So I think it's a greater sense of transparency and cleanliness around the way that the representative political system works so that they can see that vested interests aren't corrupting the system. And although they don't want to constantly be engaged themselves, they want to have that openness and access to the system, which enables them to intervene when they do want to step in.
So, Gerry, I'm still going to say, if you personally could pick one thing, what would it be?
Okay. I think probably above all, it would be, for me, a shift in the way that political parties are financed. I think that if you could convince people that political parties aren't beholden to significant vested interests, and those, I think, reflect some of the vested interests in the media as well, which is an issue which we haven't touched on, but I think is one of the great blights of current contemporary democracies. In Britain, certainly that is a significant issue, but elsewhere I think it is also an issue, the extent to which the media has corrupted so much of our politics. So if I could extend my wish to removing the corruptive influence of money and media barons on politics, then that would be my top wish.
The next person is Dr. Rosalind Fuller, who was my guest on episode 2 in season 2, talking about the role of direct democracy in ancient Athens. Rosalind is a Canadian-Irish academic and columnist, specialising in public international law and the impact of technological innovation on democracy. She'd like to see quite dramatic change, although she does recognise that it may take time.
Just one thing. I think I'd change many things. I think I would go for getting rid of representation and having people decide directly online. I don't know if that counts as one thing, because that's quite an ambitious model. Something I think that we can do to try to bring that day forward at the moment is have, politicians who pledge to obey the will of their constituents. So someone who would say, I'm, elected as a representative, but I will do what my constituents direct me to do. I think that would be a way of moving forward to that. One thing I would change, because I think that is the key to everything else. It has to start with changing the structures. You cannot change the parameters without changing the structure. So you could wish for A, B, or C to happen, but it won't happen until you change the underlying structures and the incentives people have to act. So that's a kind of a pretty broad wish, but that's what I would change.
Up next is Max Hardy, who was a guest in Season 1, Episode 12, talking about facilitating deliberative mini-publics in Australia. Max is the principal at Max Hardy Consulting, where he works with leaders and organisations to achieve results through collaboration. Not surprisingly, Max would like to see citizens involved more directly in decision-making.
I would love to see politicians being honest enough to say that we do not know the answer to some of these issues, such as our response to climate change, for instance, being one, and to actually support a process which could be televised, a deliberative process where evidence is given from a range of perspectives, where options are considered, and where there's commitment to act on the advice. I think we have, as challenging as it is for some of these processes, I think provided there was lots of good explanation about how that process might add value, I do believe that what would come out of that would be much less tainted. I think we're really tiring of some of these stuck political debates, whether it be in Parliament or whether it be on Q&A even, that people are arguing from particular positions, making a set of assumptions and engaging in a debate that's not actually a genuine debate about seeking a wise answer. It's a debate around scoring points. It's about performance. And I just think that that's scary. I think we can do a hell of a lot better. And I know that when people are given the opportunity, given good information and time to think about it, they make wise decisions on behalf of other citizens. Our current model of government doesn't actually promote a lot of that kind of behaviour. It promotes more the point-scoring behaviour, and it's quite alienating and disturbing for the rest of us that have to continue to watch those sorts of debates, knowing that they're fuelled by a whole lot of motivations other than what might be in the interest of our country or our planet.
Carolyn Lukensmeyer was also a guest in Season 1, Episode 13, talking about her work with America Speaks. Carolyn is currently the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organisation in the United States that works to reduce political dysfunction and incivility in the political system. She identifies 2 changes, both institutional, that she'd like to see.
Well, this might surprise some of your listeners, but given the current situation that we're in the United States, if I'm forced to pick only one thing, what I would pick is that we pass a law that every eligible American is required to vote, which I know Australia has had in place for a significant number of decades. And I think in the conundrums that we are trapped in at the moment, if I were forced to pick only one, that is the one I would pick.
Yes, I can imagine that would be almost as difficult a thing to achieve as gun control in America.
Although you're right, and although I think the particular current political climate, I think there'll be more serious discussion to that than has ever been true in my lifetime. because 40% of Americans who are eligible to vote do not vote. And when you look at the whole population, if another 40% of the population voted, we would be looking at some very different possibilities. Now, if you gave me a second thing about what I would change.
Go ahead. I'd be happy.
I think we have to undo the Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United, which is a very cynical name that allows any amount of money to go into political campaigning in the United States and treats corporations as if they are people. That truly, and I'll go back to a touchstone election between Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush in 1992. In 1992, the combination of Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker and the Democratic Party and Republican Party, in total, they spent $93 million on that election. The first year after Citizens United happened, which was the Obama-Mitt Romney campaign in 2012, each of those campaigns, just the campaigns themselves, not counting the parties and not counting all the super PACs that the Supreme Court made possible through Citizens United, each of those campaigns spent $1 billion. We are now spending close to $8 billion on presidential campaigns. And as an American citizen and as a human being, I think that is immoral. I think that amount of money could be dedicated to education for every child, could be dedicated to affordable housing for every human being. So that particular Supreme Court decision unleashed it made it possible. That's what caused the Republican primary to have 17 people in it for months and months and months, because each one of those people running only had to have one or two wealthy people who were willing to keep them in. And at any rate, I don't want to get too political in this, but the Republican Party, if they could have, would have pushed a very large number of those people out very early in the process, and Donald Trump would not have been the Republican candidate. So the insidious influence of money is directly related to the outcome of this presidential campaign.
Ben Peake shared his experience as a member of the Residents' Reference Panel for the Davenport Community Rail Overpass Project in episode 17 of Season 1. He identifies the need to respect expertise.
Well, what I always find strange is because everyone's viewpoint has to be given equal consideration, it means that people who are experts in a given field, their opinions are weighted equally to people who are not experts in their field, which sometimes, I have many misconceptions about certain things because I don't have technical expertise to know about them. So, for instance, on this project, I didn't understand the significant difference in, say, cost or time or construction between an overpass and an underpass, which I then learned. But an expert would know that because it's their job to know that. So because I didn't know it, I'd pick, one or the other because I think one looks nicer, which is a poor place to come from when it's supposed to be a piece of infrastructure and its functionality should be fairly heavily weighted. As well as it being a government-based, funded project, it would be our tax dollars paying for it, so the cost of it should be considered as well. Whereas, because of my lack of expertise, I was just going, but this one would be prettier. So I feel like in our democracy, although everyone's voice should be heard and considered, I feel as though there should be a bit more weight to people who are educated in the field or have experience doing similar projects or just otherwise would have more insight than your average Joe or Jane.
Carolyn Victor was a member of the Dogs and Cats Citizens Jury in South Australia and was also part of episode 17 in Season 1. She would like democracy to make more use of technology.
I would make it online. I think that, if there's a secure, it doesn't have to be from the comfort of your own home. I think could be an unreachable network within polling booths. You don't need to make it as vulnerable as the the census, I think that was incredibly vulnerable. I think democracy would be good if it was just at our little local school over here and we push the button that we like, and that's democracy, but it's all digital. It's not paper. I think there's a huge amount of waste. And I think there's too much hype. I'm not the type, you know.
I first spoke with Assistant Professor Didier Calawarts in episode 14 of Season 1, where he talked about the G1000 in Belgium. Didier is an Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the VUB. He would like to set up systems which support a long-term focus in decision-making.
Okay, well, I've been involved in a project with Michael McKenzie at the University of Pittsburgh on democratic myopia, and that's democracy's tendency to focus on the short term. And because current democracies are mostly representative, they're based on short electoral cycles, these democracies tend to focus on the short term. They tend to generate immediate benefits with costs on the long term. And I think that one of the changes I would make is I want to find some way in which we could introduce a long-term perspective into politics and policies. And I think that one of the things we're doing research on is to find some way of making sure that future generations have a place in policies and politics. And Michael and I have done research on the way in which citizen deliberation could improve democracy's focus on the long term. And what we find is that if you ask people to start paying costs right now for policies that will only have positive effects within the next 40 years, they're unwilling to do so because, well, it costs too much and the uncertainty of the future is too large. But what we found is that if you put people together and have them deliberate these issues, then support for long-term policies actually increases. So the one thing I would change about democracy is finding some way of including future generations in a long-term perspective and doing it in a participatory and deliberative manner.
So in your work, looking at democratic myopia, have you sort of looked at this issue that is floating around about a House of Reviews comprising citizens, so, selected by sortition?
I haven't done research on that myself yet, but I recently proposed a large research project to the European Research Council on democratic myopia, in which sortition and a House of Reviews based on sortition would be a part of that project. So if I get the money, I'll be able to spend a lot of attention to that issue and try to research it empirically. But I haven't been able to do that as yet.
Emily Jenke shared her experiences designing and facilitating deliberative mini-publics in South Australia in episode 10 of Season 1. Emily is the co-CEO of Democracy Co., a consultancy focused on helping people come together to consider complex issues and make lasting decisions. She identifies two challenges, both of which are structural.
Yes, my business partner and I talk about this all the time. For me, it's actually two things. The first one is longer terms of office. So what we bump into is policy that gets created in 1 year and 3 or 4 years later gets completely demolished and recreated again slightly differently because it's actually at the whim of a change of government. If we had longer terms, we'd actually have people who wouldn't have to worry about campaigning in the next year or two and could actually settle down into much longer, much more sustainable sort of decision making. So that's the first one that is always on the top of my mind when I answer that question. And the second one is changing the way political parties are funded. So actually having them publicly funded by the taxpayer as opposed to being privately funded. And the reason that that's important is because then the public, society, would actually be in charge and pulling the purse strings in terms of how much money is spent during a campaign and what it's spent on. And I just think there's a big inequality. However big I think there's determines whether or not you get elected. And I just don't think that's the best model.
And finally, Professor Jeanette Harps-Karp, who I spoke with in episode 5 of Season 1, about her work in Western Australia, designing and managing large deliberative mini-publics. Jeanette is a professor in the Sustainability Policy Unit at Curtin University in Western Australia. Jeanette would like to see much more co-decision making.
Yeah, well, it would be decision makers understanding the value of getting to co-decisions together with people. It would be decision makers making the first move, I think, in seeing that if we really did deliberative democracy, if we did deliberative mini-publics, every time that there wasn't a clear answer that the politicians didn't think that they really obviously knew what to do, if they would simply spend co-decision making instead of top-down decision making, decisions with instead of decisions over, I think we would have far more of a trusting, trustworthy system. And the people would be far more involved in the decisions that matter to them. And that's what a democracy is about.
Thank you for joining me today. In the next episode of Real Democracy Now! Podcast, I'll be talking to a number of people about the relationship between representative democracy and capitalism. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.